In this module, we start off by just asking the question, what are human rights? I think intuitively we all have an understanding of what that means to us. But I think it's useful to distinguish between two different ways of looking at what human rights are. The one way would be, let's say, moral or metaphysical almost. And that is the sense that all human beings have an unalienable right to certain things. We get that notion maybe from religious texts, or we look into the very nature of human beings and we find that this is an entitlement that we have just by virtue of being human. A different sense of what human rights are would be that these are the entitlements that we can invoke, hold states accountable to before courts of law, for example. In that sense, we talk about entitlements that make us as individuals rights holders, and then there would be duty bearers, usually the state as a duty bearer. So there's a relationship of a rights holder and a duty bearer. In other words, the state in this case would be accountable to uphold the specific rights that have been articulated in a constitution or in a legal text like an international treaty. So the kinds of responsibilities that the state may have, we could divide into obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill. Respect obligations on states entail that states have to kind of leave us alone. Respect means that we should be able to function without state interference. And the freedom of expression is often understood as a right that entails that obligation. Because if we want to come together, for example, form a publishing house, have a printing press, the obligation to respect entails that the government should not intervene. The government should merely leave us alone to engage in our free expression. That is the obligation to respect. But a different conceptual obligation of the government would be the obligation to protect. That is the obligation to protect us individuals from other non-state actors, or let's say other individuals. In other words, the state would have a law that allows us to take action against another individual that defames us, that infringes our dignity with their freedom of expression. So it's about balancing of rights in this particular case, but the government is obliged to ensure that there is respect of our rights through the obligation to protect us from others. In other words, generally speaking, there is an obligation on the government not only to leave us alone, but sometimes to ensure that we are protected from others who may want to or may invade our rights. And the third level of obligation, so there was respect, protect, and the third is fulfill, would be when the government actually has to make resources available and take concerted action to realize a particular right. That classically would, for example, be the right to housing. If we say that the right means that the government has to set out policies and maybe make resources available to ensure that housing is being provided to individuals in a particular society, that would be the obligation to fulfill. Now, we said that the obligations can come from national law, like legislation in constitutions in particular. Your rights may be there, the obligations of the government may be there, but they may also be in international treaties. And let me just say briefly something about the source and the background of these treaties. The treaties that bind us and that are relevant in this particular course may come from two sources, the United Nations and the African Union. So international human rights treaties can be adopted by the United Nations. That is an intergovernmental organization, obviously, that brings together all the nations of the world. And it has a number of treaties, human rights related treaties that are relevant. For example, there is an international covenant on civil and political rights that had been adopted as far back as 1966, and that most states in the world had become party to, had ratified. And when we talk about freedom of expression, it is important that one asks oneself, did the particular state in which I find myself, did it ratify this international covenant? And if so, that state has an obligation under that covenant. The Covenant has a treaty body which is called the Human Rights Committee, and the treaty body, the committee, supervises or monitors the state's compliance or obedience, if you like, to the treaty. There are a number of these treaties in the United Nations, and some of them have particular bearing and importance for freedom of expression. So we look into those. Each of them each has its own particular treaty monitoring mechanisms, and these mechanisms perform their function in the main through state reporting. So states report to these treaty bodies. The treaty bodies examine the state's reports, and then they adopt what are called concluding observations, in which the states are directed to improve their human rights record in particular ways. I mentioned also the African Union. So in Africa at least, all African states are members of the African Union, and within the African Union framework, a number of international treaties have been adopted. The primary among those is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The Charter speaks to freedom of expression, and the body which supervises or monitors the African Charter and the compliance by states with the Charter is called the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. There is also now, in recent years, the last decade has seen the entry into the institutional landscape of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. It is located in Arusha in Tanzania, and it complements the protective mandate of the African Commission. So a case can go to the Commission and then go on to the court, or if states have accepted the direct access to the court, then individuals may go directly to the court. So the African Charter is being enforced or monitored and interpreted by both the Commission and the court. There are many other treaties within the African Union that are of relevance, and I would highlight the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. Clearly, the issue of governance and elections are intimately linked to issues of freedom of expression. Let me then conclude my remarks on this module about the link between democracy and freedom of expression. Because I think freedom of expression is one of the absolute requirements for a functional and legitimate democracy. You can think for yourself how improbable it is that an election could be called free and fair if there were restrictions on freedom of expression. It is the hallmark of a free and fair election that those who stand for elected office would be able to persuade the voters. So they must have unfettered access to the voters' ears and minds, so that people could be persuaded to vote in a particular way. If there are constraints on freedom of expression during election time, clearly that would impinge very seriously on the prospect of having a free and fair election in place.